Hello again. This is Lawrence Holgate, and this is episode 11 of Understanding John Stuart Mill and his classic book, Utilitarianism. I'll repeat what I do every time. If you have my book, you can always follow along as I read and make comments on Mill's utilitarianism. And if you don't have the book, you can get it right now on Amazon.com, or at least you can get a digital copy right now and join the crowd again. We're discussing in this episode the fifth chapter and final chapter of Mill's short book, Utilitarianism. It's about the connection between justice and utility. And here is where utilitarianism meets its most important challenge. Unlike the several criticisms of the theory that we discussed much earlier in episode 2, I believe, the challenges in Chapter 5 are moral challenges. In Chapter 2 of Utilitarianism, Mill answered criticisms that were based on mistaken interpretations of his theory. But in this chapter, the criticism is that utilitarianism would have us approve of actions that are simply morally unacceptable. The utilitarian theory, opponents say in Mill's time, and even now, utilitarianism justifies conduct that is unjust or a violation of fundamental rights. Any ethical theory that would justify such conduct, they say, should be discarded on the trash heap of failed philosophical speculation. Now, Mill takes the criticism very seriously. To make it easier to follow, what I've done in my book, Understanding John Stuart Mill, is to break the chapter down into several short sections. So we're going to start now with section 1, 5.1, with the title Injustice and the Feelings of Injustice. Whether we believe that injustice is natural or instinctive, most of us are familiar with the way we react to situations in which we believe that an injustice has been done. If a woman is refused promotions that are regularly given to the men with whom she works, many of us, upon hearing something like this, would get upset, or we're just outraged by the injustice of giving promotions based on gender. But Mill cautions that the fact that there are such emotional responses should not lead us to conclude that these feelings of injustice correspond to some kind of independent moral principle. Here's what he says at page 41 of his book. Mill says, it is one thing to believe that we have natural feelings of injustice, and another to acknowledge them as the ultimate criterion of conduct. Mankind are always predisposed to believe that any subjective feeling, not otherwise accounted for, is a revelation of some objective reality. Suppose you're at the zoo and you see a Bengal tiger. You might turn to your friend and say, that tiger is terrifying. You're reporting your own subjective feelings about the tiger, not an objective feature that the tiger possesses. You observe, you see that the tiger is quite large. He has sharp teeth, a light orange coat, black stripes, and a white belly. You don't see an additional feature called terrifying. By analogy, if you have a strong feeling of injustice when you witness an unarmed man being shot in the back by the police, you see the act of the man being shot by the police, but you don't see an unjust act. Instead, you use a criterion of conduct to infer the injustice of the act from an application of that criterion or principle to what you've just witnessed. The philosophical question that Mill asks is whether the subjective feelings of justice and injustice, which are admittedly much stronger than the feelings which attach to simple expediency, require a totally different origin. Is there a moral principle, independent of utility, that both supports the inference and explains your feelings of injustice? In, let's say, the gender discrimination example that I gave earlier and the police shooting case? As Mill puts it, does justice have an existence in nature as something absolute, generically distinct from every variety of the expedient and, in idea, opposed to it? Is justice a name for an absolute moral rule or criterion of conduct that exists somehow independently of the principle of utility? and which requires conduct that is a higher obligation than an obligation to promote the general good? That's how Mill frames the question. Let's go to section 5.2 in the book. If you're holding the paper copy, it's page 77. If you've got the digital copy, this is section 5.2. It has the title, Modes of Conduct Considered to be Unjust. Now, the first step toward answering these questions is to define the term unjust. To accomplish this, Mill takes a page from Plato's Socratic Dialogues, for example, the Euthyphro, and he writes that the best way to find a definition is to identify several situations in which we use the word unjust, and then ask what these situations might have in common. First, let's take a look at the 6 situations of injustice Mill identifies. The first one is the concept of violating the legal rights of others. That is, there is a use of injustice in which we say that it means the violation of the legal rights of others. For example, you host a philosophy club party at your house. During the party, someone enters your bedroom and goes through the dresser drawer where you keep your wallet and keys. He steals both and drives away in your car. Would you say that's unjust? Mill thinks you would. I might just say wrong, but Mill says unjust and wrong, or wrong because it's unjust. So injustice here has been paired with, or means, the violation of the legal rights of others. The second use that Mill identifies, taking or withholding from any person that to which he or she has a moral right. I'll repeat that. Injustice is the taking or withholding from any person that to which they have a moral right. For example, miscegenation laws in the South, which prohibited interracial marriage in several states of the USA, those laws were not struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court until 1976, believe it or not. During the years before the Supreme Court decision, there were many people of different races who believed they had a moral right to marry, even though they had no legal right to do so, at least in the South. The third use of the word injustice, obtaining a good or undergoing an evil which one does not deserve. I'll repeat, obtaining a good or undergoing an evil which one does not deserve now. For example, being awarded a scholarship even though you did not meet the minimum qualifications. Getting a failing grade in a class because you refused to date the professor's daughter. In both cases, we would not hesitate to say that an injustice has been done. Here's the fourth use that Mill identifies. Breaking faith with anyone. That is, by breaking faith, he means failing to keep a promise, violating an engagement, or disappointing expectations raised by your own conduct. For example, you break a promise to help a classmate study for the final exam. Or you did not show up at her apartment, even though earlier in the day you led her to believe that you were going to help her. That's what he means by breaking faith. Fifth, being partial. Another use of the word injustice, showing favor or preference to one person over another in matters to which favor or preference simply don't apply. For example, a judge in a court of law refuses to recuse herself from the case which she is deciding, even though it involves a lawsuit brought by a stranger against her favorite cousin. Perhaps she hides the fact that her favorite cousin is the one who is being given this lawsuit, or is the subject of the lawsuit. Sixth and final, equality. Treating like cases alike and different cases differently, provided that the likenesses and differences are relevant. This is more an example of justice, but we'll talk about it as injustice. For example, we would deem it unjust to treat persons the same, although they are relevantly different. And secondly, it's an injustice to treat persons differently, although they are relevantly alike. For example, two students, let's call them Gertrude and Edgar, they have the same scores on all exams, quizzes, and lab work in their physics class. But at the end of the term, Edgar is awarded an A and Gertrude gets a B. All right? Everybody would say that's unjust. And Mill says that, well, what we're doing here is that we're pairing justice with equality and injustice with inequality. We're not treating like cases alike, and we're not saying that different cases are being treated differently. So now here we got 6 cases of injustice, and the second step that Mill takes is to examine these uses of the term injustice, and in an attempt to find the mental link that holds them together. What do these cases have in common? He's asking Plato's question. He wants to find out what injustice is, and he says the only way we're going to do this is to look at all of these cases in which we use the word and try to find out what is in common. Mill answers the question by taking a hint from the etymology of the word. He finds that the primitive origin of the word justice is conformity to law. Returning to the 6 examples of the ordinary language use of the word unjust, Mill argues that what they have in common is that all of them involve a breach of law, where the word law has a broad meaning now that includes any kind of rule or conduct or command, any kind of rule or command, legal or moral, that is backed with a sanction. That's what he means by the word law here. Here's what he says. When we think that a person is bound in justice to do something, it is an ordinary form of language to say that he ought to be compelled to do it. We should be gratified to see the obligation enforced by anybody who had the power. Let me repeat that. This is what Mill says is common to all of the 6 cases that he's already discussed. He says that when we think that a person is bound in justice to do something, it is an ordinary form of language to say that he ought to be compelled to do it. We should be gratified to see the obligation enforced by anybody who had the power. I'm reading from Mill's Utilitarianism at page 47 of the Hackett edition. Let's get on now to section 5.3, the difference between morality and expediency. The preceding definition of just and unjust doesn't take us very far. The idea of a violation of law that is backed with a sanction is also built into any notion, any kind of wrongdoing. If you say of anyone, friend or foe, that they have done something you believe to be wrong, then depending on whether the wrongdoing is legal or moral, you imply either that they should be punished, ostracized, verbally condemned, or at a minimum, they should feel and express remorse for what they did. Mill puts it this way: we do not call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished in some way or other for doing it. If not by law, by the opinion of his fellow creatures. If not by opinion, by the reproaches of his own conscience. Page 47 again of Utilitarianism. Wrongdoing and acts of injustice can both be distinguished from imprudent acts for this reason, that the wrongdoer and the unjust person have done what they are morally bound not to do. They are proper objects of punishment, Mill puts it this way. By way of contrast, persons who do something imprudent, for example, amateurs who rock climb without a safety line, are doing something we wish they would not do, but they have no moral obligation to refrain from doing it. That would be an example of an imprudent act. Nor do we think that they should be punished for failing to change their behavior. A side remark now that I make in the book at the bottom of page 79 in bold sentences. In his essay on liberty, Mill makes a distinction between other regarding and self-regarding acts. The former are acts that cause harm to others. The latter are acts that only cause harm to oneself. Acts of wrongdoing, including unjust acts, belong in the other regarding class, and the imprudent acts are self-regarding. Mill uses the distinction in On Liberty to determine what acts are justifiably punishable by law and by public opinion. We'll talk about this again in a later section. The difference between Justice and Other Branches of Morality. That's the title of section 5.4. If injustice is a type of wrongdoing, then what is it that distinguishes it from other types? Mill answers this question by borrowing a distinction from the ethical theory playbook. That's my word, playbook. This is at page 48 of Utilitarianism. Mill says this. He says, ethical writers divide moral duties into two classes, denoted by the ill-chosen expressions, duties of perfect and of imperfect obligation. The latter, imperfect obligation, being those in which, though the act is obligatory, the particular occasions of performing it are left to our choice, as in the case of charity or beneficence, which we are indeed bound to practice, but not toward any definite person, nor at any prescribed time. You have an obligation to do charitable things, but not for any particular person. In the more precise language of philosophic jurists, duties of perfect obligation are those duties in virtue of which a correlative right resides in some person or persons. Duties of imperfect obligation are those moral obligations which don't give birth to any right. So a duty of perfect obligation is tied up with a right. Duties of imperfect obligation are not. We have obligations which are not bound to any right. For example, the right to life is a duty of perfect obligation because we believe that we have a right to life. And therefore, everyone else has an obligation to honor that right and not to do something that would take that away or violate it. Examples. Again, we have an imperfect obligation to give help to others when help is needed. But we're not morally required to do this for a specific person or at a specific time. The charities to which I give annual donations do not send me literature telling me that they have a right to my money. It's otherwise with duties of perfect obligation. For example, the duty not to kill that I just talked about. We have a prima facie duty because there is a correlative right to life possessed by all persons all the time. We cannot choose the person to whom it applies, nor can we choose the time to which it applies. Mill writes that this feature is exactly the distinction between justice and other forms of morality. He says justice implies something which it is not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. Think about this now. This is at Utilitarianism, page 49. Justice is a concept that implies something which it is not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from us as his moral right. When we say that an action is unjust, we imply that a right has been violated. In the 6 examples that Mill has already spelled out, there is an implication that a wrong has been done, a right has been violated, and some assignable person who has been wronged. When I say that it is unjust for someone to have taken my wallet, car keys, and my car, I imply by the word unjust that this is wrong. I am the person who has been wronged, and the specific wrong is a violation of my right to property. If you break a promise to help your classmate study for the examination, this is not only wrong, it is wrong because it is a violation of your classmate's right to your help, a right that you had conferred on him or her when you made the promise. If Edgar is treated better than Gertrude when their physics professor gives a higher grade to Edgar than he gave to Gertrude, even though they scored the same in all exams, he violated Gertrude's right to equal treatment. Now, that's the concept of right, of a right, which Mill pins on the idea of justice. The concept of justice logically implies the concept of a right. We're going to study this and talk about it more in my next section next week, and I promise to try very hard to do it on Monday. I'm sorry about this one that occurs on a Tuesday, but I won't even explain how it happened. Anyway, see you later. See you on Monday, this Monday. Bye-bye.